we can't put a woman in the leading role. Everyone's just going to be wondering what she's doing there. We had a few of them, in our partner group. I'm sorry they left, but there's really not much we can do about that. It's not like anyone puts up a stop sign. Women just have different interests. These quotes are unfortunately not from the last century, but these are things that I've heard working in the creative industries in the last few years. My name is Nina Åkestam Wikner, pronounced in Swedish, and I am the head of strategy at NordDB. I am a marketing PhD, a writer, and I was up just until recently a commissioner for the Swedish government in the Commission for Equal Lifetime Income. That's me now, but that was not always the case. So about 15 years ago, I graduated from university and got my very first job in advertising. This is me then. And I was so excited about this job because not only did I get to work with amazing clients and really fun colleagues, and sometimes I got to drink beer during office hours, amazing for a 22-year-old, but I also really felt like this was an amazing time to join this industry as a young woman. Because my entire life, actually being part of the same country community that Mia just talked about, I had been told that the gender equality thing was fixed. I did not have to worry about that anymore. Because people before me had done that. So if I just worked hard, studied hard, did my best, I would have the same opportunities and the same evaluations as anyone else. I would say that that sentiment lasted for about 15 minutes into my first job, because that's how long it took for the first client to hand me their coat when we met, because they thought I was the receptionist and not their strategist. And the first time it happened, of course, I wrote it off to just coincidence. They just made a mistake. Honest mistake, no worries. The fifth time, I was starting to get a little bit concerned. And by the 10th time, I had become sort of a radical feminist. So that was sort of the radicalization of my political views at that time. So since then, I have spent the main part of my work trying to figure out ways for the creative industries, advertising in particular, to be better, to be more inclusive, to make sure that more people can do their best work in this community and thereby improve the work that we actually do. It's been really fun, but also really challenging. So I've been doing this for a long time, and now I have about 30 minutes to summarize everything I've learned for you. So it's going to be quite intense, but I think we can make it, right? Yes? Good. Let's go. So the first thing you want to do when you approach a topic like this is, of course, ask yourself, is it just me? Was it just because I looked a certain way, or was it something about me that made all those clients hand me their coats? And the thing is that no, it's definitely not just you. Because we have been doing a lot of research in this area for a long time. And it looks the same way pretty much all over the place. So let me share some numbers. Today, in Sweden, 2022, women have about 75% of the lifetime income of men. In the same country, this very beacon of gender equality, there are more Johan CEOs than women CEOs in public companies. And in Denmark, by the way, that guy is called Lars. If we move across the pond to the US, we know that women get about 18% of the startup funding, meaning that men get 81%. And if we try to find the numbers for women of color, we can't, because they're so small that they don't even show up in the statistics. Moving back to this part of the world, we know that Afro-Swedish execs make about 76% of what white execs do for doing the same job. And what all of this, for example, leads to is that we know that in advertising, women and people of color are underrepresented in professional and speaking roles everywhere, globally. So what happens behind the scenes sort of shows on the scene. And this is bad. So, I mean, how is this possible? Being that everyone says that they're for equality. These numbers are for markets where most people would say that they definitely support gender equality. They support equality between all people. Looking at this, you really have to ask yourself the most academic question of all, namely, what the F is going on here? And I've been trying to figure this out for a long time, and I've asked myself that question. I've also asked a lot of smart people that question. And if we look at sort of the daily life, when we talk about this like over dinner or at parties, I would say that the answers tend to end up in one of two piles. The first one is some version of, well, of course, it's because of the women. Women don't lean in. They don't speak up. They make the wrong choices. They take too much parental leave. They don't choose the right types of education. They're bad negotiators. They don't speak in the right tone of voice. And they don't stand in, powerful enough postures. That's why we see these numbers. Another pile of answers tend to be some version of, well, no, women are not to blame, but definitely men are to blame. Because men, especially in business, tend to gang up and form their little boys club, where they sort of actively work to keep women and people who are not like them in any aspect out of power, because they want to guard the power that they have. If we look at academia, which is sort of where I tend to go to answers, we will find that in fact, both of these sort of piles of groups of answers have some truth to them, definitely, but they're not the full picture. In fact, it's more like, and now I've put a trigger warning in here because now I'm going to be speaking in academic language, which might sound really, really boring, but in fact it's really interesting. So just bear with me. I will not be, the PhD me. I will try to explain it in sort of a nice, accessible manner. There are really good theories on what's going on here in society to make this happen. And I'm going to share 3 of them that I think are most interesting right now. The first one has been sort of a buzzword for a while. I'm sure most of you have heard the word unconscious bias, right? Yes. The good thing about this buzzword in particular is that it's actually true. Because there are a lot of buzzwords that don't really mean anything. But unconscious bias can really help us understand how it's possible that so many people say they want equality, but still we don't see the numbers changing fast enough. So unconscious bias is about the fact that the human brain is really lazy. We hate thinking. So that means that our mind does its very best all the time to create shortcuts. We end up with mental maps in our heads that will help us make decisions. So that's why when we wake up in the morning, we don't have to remember or actively think about how to brush our teeth or how to make breakfast or how to find the best way to work. We just do it almost automatically. I'm sure most of you have that sort of routine in the morning, right? What happens though, this is really good for brushing your teeth or going to work. It's a problem when we apply it to our social relationships, because then we tend to do the exact same thing. So based on what we've experienced before, we make up a mental map of what people look like who should be in a certain position, and then we sort of act on that. And I think the word unconscious here is really key, because this is not something that we decide to do. It just happens because our brain is so lazy. So actually, that's what happened when those clients started handing me their coats. Because to them, based on their mental maps, I did not look like a strategist who should help them and sort of expand their multi-million-dollar advertising spend portfolios. I looked like a person who should be sort of dealing with the reception. I was supposed to bring them coffee. Like that's how my age, my gender, everything about me said receptionist. So they weren't trying to be mean. They were just having assumptions, unconscious biases on who should do what in this workplace. The bad news are that we all have these unconscious biases. It doesn't matter how educated we are, how many different types of people we have met in our lives, how much we've traveled, we have the biases. They're there because we have human brains. The good news are that once we know that we have these biases, we can actively work to counter them. We can be aware of the mental sort of maps we have, and we can start challenging them. It is a lot of work, but it's definitely possible. So that's unconscious bias. The second thing that I found really interesting studying this academically is something called stereotype threat. Have any of you heard of that? Some? Not as sort of buzzy as unconscious bias, but definitely still a word that some of you have heard of. So unconscious bias is about the relationships that we have with other people. Stereotype threat is sort of the flip side of that. It sort of explains what happens when we personally are exposed to unconscious bias. Let me give an example. This was a really interesting study that was done in the US about 20 years ago, and it has since been repeated across different countries and different types of populations. What they did in this study was that they took a class of college students, engineering students, so like really smart people, good at math specifically. And they gave these people a math quiz. And this was a regular class, so some, all genders in the class, some good at math, some good and bad students. They did the quiz, the teachers gathered them up, sort of marked them, and handed them back. And they logged the results. It turned out that some people did good, some people did not so good, but there was no gender bias. In the class, some people were great at math, some others were not dependent on gender. They took a similar class, similar grades, gave them the same math quiz, but before the quiz, they showed the entire class different types of images that stereotyped women, specifically advertising, because that's a good source to go to if you want to find a lot of stereotypes typically. So they showed the students these images for a while, and then they got to do the math quiz. And what happened in this group was that the women started underperforming. So all of a sudden, there was a gender difference in the results. So all of a sudden, women were worse at math. And this study has been repeated across different types of populations. They have done it with African American students. They have done it with different types of age groups and activated stereotypes this way, and then asked people to perform something and see their results being worse. It's really interesting that the jury is still out on exactly what's going on in our minds when this happens. Some researchers say that it's probably because we're reminded of how hard it's going to be to succeed, for example, as a woman in this engineering business, so we sort of give up before we've even started. Other people see that it's that we then start thinking about all sorts of different things regarding to the stereotypes, and then we sort of don't focus so much on the task at hand. We'll see where the research lands on that, but we do know that this is a thing that happens. And that's why it's so important that we never point out each other's differences in a group. Because sometimes we do that as a compliment. It could be like, it's so nice to finally have a woman boss. Or I love your hair, it's so cool, I wish I could do my hair that way. Just never ever do that, because what you're at risk of doing is that you activate a stereotype with the person you're trying to be nice to and actually make them perform worse at their job. And of course, we don't want to do that. So that's sort of a tip of the day. Finally, and this is something that I think we really don't talk enough about in this context, is tradition. Because like I said, the human brain is really lazy. And the most common reason for us to do something is not that we think it's the best way, it's not that it's the smartest or even the most emotionally sensible thing to do, it's because we did it yesterday. So we tend to always repeat the things that we do. They don't have to be optimized or even work particularly well. We just do it because we can't sort of bring up the energy enough to change. And we see this all the time if we look at business, for example, how many things are just there because they've always been that way. And that is because it's so much work to change something. But it's, of course, a work that we need to do. But I think that we always need to sort of check ourselves. What of all the choices that I make are there because they are based on tradition? Not because I chose them, but because it seems like the right thing to do. So this is where we stand. We have some really depressing numbers, and we have some sort of social and psychological explanations for these numbers, and some of them are really hard to change. What should we do about this? Like I said, I've been thinking about this for a very long time, and I have realized that I think that the only solution to this problem is that we all need to become chief feminist officers of our own careers. And what do I mean by that? Let me break it down for you academically. So, a chief feminist officer, or CFMO, unfortunately the CFO thing is already taken, so I had to put the EM in there as well. I'm sorry about that, but this also sounds quite nice, I think. So a CFMO is a person who performs feminist actions at work to lift others. And I'm going to walk you through why I think this definition is important, step by step. So first of all, in the first line, you see that the CFMO is a person, not a woman, a person of any gender. Really important. Anyone can be a CFMO. On the second line, you have that this person performs feminist actions. So this person doesn't like inclusion or diversity. They're not for or pro equality or diversity. They actually take actions, measurable, concrete actions in their everyday lives in order to make this happen. So that's what it's about. Not what you think, but what you actually do. On the third line, we have at work, because I'm sure that a lot of you are feminist activists in your free time, in your personal life. This is sort of the work version of that. And I also wanted to put work in there quite broadly, because I believe that this is not something that's restricted to having a manager role. So for example, I have been a manager for the full amount of 8 weeks, but I've managed to do this before that. Of course, it's easier to implement it if you finally have a position of power where you can sort of change the structures. Thinking about the conversation that was just before me on stage, that's of course better, but if everyone uses their platforms, whatever they might be, to do these feminist actions, we can still see a lot of impact. So if you have any kind of interactions with people in your work life, I think this is the way that you can be working. Finally, the last line, to lift others. This is something that I find so important, and the more I work on these issues, the more important it is to me. That feminism, or working for inclusion, equality, diversity, whatever you want to call it, can never be about yourself. It cannot be limited to yourself. Because it's only when we structurally work to lift each other that we can build the momentum that we need to actually overcome those hurdles, those tradition-based, bias-based hurdles that we put up there to actually make a difference. So always think about, how can I share this? How can I do something bigger about this thing that I just discovered? How can I make sure that it doesn't stay with me? I would also like to speak a bit about what the CFMO is not, because having been on stages like this for quite a while, I feel like it's so easy in these moments to be like super inspired by all the smart and cool people around you, and you just want to be like them, and you want to be like this big boss, you want to be this power lady, and that's not really what a CFMO is about. So I'm going to share some examples of what a CFMO is not. First of all, being a CFMO is not having an opinion. I think having values and opinions is a great foundation for doing good work, because that's sort of where we come back to find our source of energy at the end of the day, but it's not going to be enough. This is always having to be guided by actions. Small, big, systematic actions. That's the only way that we're going to figure this out together. I feel like I'm repeating myself a bit here, but this is so, so important. So whenever someone says, well, I'm really for gender equality, diversity, inclusion, just always keep asking them, great, so what are you going to do about it? Because there's always something we can do about it. Because that, I am for this or I support this, that's your invitation as a CFMO. This is someone who's on your team. They want to join, but maybe they don't know how. So just make sure that you take their hand and sort of help them on board to start performing the actions. So don't call them out on not knowing what to do. We've all been beginners at some point. That's fine. Just make sure that you help them transfer them from the I'm for, I like, I enjoy to the I will do section. Second, a CFMO is not necessarily a power lady. And what I want to say about this is not that there aren't a lot of power ladies out there who are also CFMOs, plenty, but it's not a personality type. Anyone can be a CFMO. Some of the most low-key people I know are excellent at doing these actions continuously to promote inclusion in the workplace. You can be the most chilled, laid-back, introverted, down-to-earth person and still be a brilliant CFMO. Some of the best people that I've worked with on this have been like this very sort of timid and older men who sort of tend to sit quiet in the room, but then you just talk about these issues and then you see sort of a glare in their eyes and you know that you're on board, you know this. And those tend to be the people who then go out and actually do shit to make this happen. So be very conscious about not mixing personality with actual power or abilities to get stuff done. Because it's so much more inspirational to be a doer than to be a power lady, even though they can be awesome. I mean, I'm not putting Iris Apfel down here, she's great. Another thing that the CFMO is not is a girl boss. And again, a girl boss can be a CFMO, but it's not enough. Because being a girl boss is mainly about lifting yourself. It's about being this kick-ass person who sort of breaks the rules and fends their own way, and that's great. But if you want to really make a change, you have to bring people on board. And I know that this can be a bit controversial because there has been so much talk in these sort of contexts in the last few years about having, the role models and being inspired. And I think that's great, but you need to also inspire to action. That's the way to do it. So girl boss, good, but not enough. Finally, watching cat videos is a hobby. Being a CFMO is not. So I know that there are so many companies, organizations out there who say that they love inclusion and diversity. They're so supportive. They're so passionate. Still, they don't assign a budget. They don't have a trained person in charge of running this part of their business. And it usually ends up being sort of a team of typically young women doing this sort of in their spare time, maybe arranging a mentorship program or some events, and they don't really get credit for it. It's not folded into their evaluation system. It will never get them promoted. It will just take time away from the work that they're already struggling twice as hard as the guys to get done. So in my opinion, that's not the way that we should do this. You would never sort of trust a company who says that, well, we're so passionate about accounting that we just feel, it's natural for us. It just happens. No, you would ask, like, who is in charge of accounting in this place? And is that person professional? Are they trained? Will they make this happen? Do they do it right? Can you see measurable results of what they actually do? And those are, of course, the standards that we need to put on our inclusion and diversity work in any type of organization. And thank you. And I think it is on us as CFMOs to make sure to ask those questions, drive the issues, and when it's time, be the person who should do this professionally. Because I know a lot of you are in this room who could take that route. So just make sure to get that budget. My time is almost up. And I want to just sort of summarize this by sharing a few things that I keep coming back to when I talk about these issues. First of all, and this is something that's easily forgotten, especially in a room like this, when you feel so supported and we're all sort of heading in the same direction, equality is radical. We have never, as human beings, been able to create a society that is truly equal. So we don't know exactly what would happen if we managed to do that. That means that it is in itself a very radical idea that would change the way society works. So Bell Hooks knew this. She's in this picture. This is an old picture of her. She unfortunately passed away not too long ago. One of the most influential and important feminist philosophers and writers of our time. If you haven't read her books, please do. They're so accessible, so interesting. And she has like the perfect way of sort of getting you on board with the idea that what we're trying to do here is really radical. It's worth it anyway, but it is radical. And that's why we keep running into these hurdles all the time. It's not because people don't get it. It's because it's so hard to change. And we want change. We want radical change. So bear that in mind. Second, I'm going to quote Gloria Steinem and say that there is no such thing as white feminism. Because if your feminism excludes 87% of the world's population, it is not feminism. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely not that. So any type of feminist analysis has to include all types of people everywhere. So if you don't do that, you need to go back, you need to read up, you need to improve your analysis in order to make sure that you actually work for the benefit of all, and not just people who are just like you. Finally, and this I think is really important, because when we do this work, when we do the CFMO work, we will run into hurdles. We will have days when everything feels like shit and we're not going anywhere. I had 2 years of that on the Commission for Gender Equal Lifetime Income, with all the politics and all the work we had to do. It just felt like we never got anywhere. Then I think it's just so important to remember why we got into this in the first place. And my best way to do that is to sort of think of myself when I'm as old as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who unfortunately also just passed away, another feminist icon. What type of life do I want to look back on? What type of sort of actions do I want to have done in order to be happy with myself? Because when I think about that, I never end up in the conclusion that I should just give this up and just try to do, business as usual, just think about myself and what would be best for me or the people closest to me. I always feel like I want to keep going, because there is really no option if I want to sort of live in the world that I want to see. So with that said, I just want to say thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nina. I'm going to spud you. That felt so strong. Thank you. And also thank you for paying tribute to Bell Hooks, who I would definitely concur with advising everybody to read at least one of her books in the next 6 weeks.
Yes. Actually, Feminist Theory from Margin Center was just translated into Swedish last year.
Amazing.
So if you feel, I know that a lot of Swedes, we're okay at English, but when it comes into the academic...
You're very good at English.
Yeah, it can be a little sort of challenging to do both the sort of social feminist part and also the English part, but it's translated. So do read that book. It's so accessible and it's so useful.
And I've been taking All About Love, the title, which is a series of essays as to dissecting the idea of love in every element of life, around with me everywhere. It's like a kind of important reference book, a bit like a Bible for me, whenever I'm on my travels. So I definitely recommend that one as well. If you would like to ask Nina a question, then please do use the QR code or use the chat function online. I'm just going to grab the iPad because I left it here. This is my thing with, I've got too many things to hold. So it will come up here and I can ask a question on your behalf. One of the things that I would like to ask you, because I felt excited and I felt like I believed this idea of equality for all and the intersections of that, is that I think as a white presenting woman in the world of work who has academia behind you as well, thank goodness, because it definitely helps elevate the conversation when you've got a PhD. But I do find, personally, as a woman of colour, you can present similar arguments to ones that you just have, or similar ideas, and it is seen as aggressive or a pushback against what is like quote unquote equal and fair, and to kind of pipe the hell down. So have you got any practical tips as to how I can deliver some of the CFMO messages with the, that may put me in a space where they are met with actual change?
I would say that you shouldn't change anything. You need to surround yourself with people who are good sounding boards. Because when I started out my career, I was really dependent on men for the same reasons. Because then I was a young woman who was always perceived as being, a bit uppity, and I don't know, speaking out of my place. And then it just really helped to try to find the men in the room who would help sort of amplify what I was saying, and not by stealing it, but just by sort of affirming that this is actually what she's saying is true, it's relevant, it's interesting, etc., etc. And I think that's because what you're explaining, that I mean, that's also everywhere in the research. Like you and I could say the exact same thing and be met by completely different reactions.
And it really is true.
Yes, it is definitely true.
I could give you many examples, but I won't bore you because I'll be here forever.
And I mean, that's why it's so important that those of us who are white and who are also feminists, because I'm not going to say white feminists because that's really not a thing, we need to be the trailblazers here to sort of help open up the conversation and to be as... I know that we might have a question about allyship later, which is the thing that I'm just a little bit wary about that word, but the concept of it, I think, is super critical because, again, feminism is always going to be about using your privileges in order to help others. So having close conversations between feminists who represent differently is always going to be super key because there are rooms where I can get access where you can't, but then I can sort of help open those doors, metaphorically.
Yes, and if we're having this conversation right now, it's part of the steps. It's the work that needs to be done. If you do the reading, if you have the conversations with people that look differently to you, but you find that you have a fundamental kind of shared opinion in equality.
Right. And I think it's also so important that, you know, because I know that a lot of white women who have worked in equality for a long time, they feel a bit threatened by all of this because they feel like they've been working so hard to make things happen, and now they're supposed to do this as well, you know? Can't anyone else do that? I've been trying so hard to sort of make women engineers, more powerful in my company or whatever. But it's just not an option to let it slide. I mean, then it's not doing the work.
Absolutely.
So I feel like it is tough. Again, because of tradition, because of bias, it's really hard to sort of, I mean, I remember that a few years ago when I started sort of reshaping my feminism from a more intersectional perspective. And I had to challenge everything I knew because I realized that I was no longer the underdog. And what does that make me? I'm sort of a middle dog now. I'm a woman, but I'm also so privileged in so many other ways. And then at first that felt a little bit weird because I have to reframe how I thought about life. But then the next day that felt like it's such a huge opportunity because then I can use my privileges in different smart ways. So I think that's
incredible. Should we all try and wake up tomorrow as middle dogs?
Yeah.
I'm going to try.
Yeah.
We've got a question here from Gunjan. Thank you so much for your question. How, as a solopreneur, show I am a CFMO, sorry, this is lots of new wording here, but I'm going to get my mouth around it, as a company culture and not just as a hobby?
Good question. I think if you're you're the only person in your company, because that's what I think a solopreneur.
I love means, that word.
Yeah. Then I would say it's going to be mostly about all the relationships that you form with others, because I guess you would do business with other people.
Yeah.
So you're going to think of ways for how, for example, when I buy things from people, how can I do that in the most feminist way possible? When I sell people, when I create my contracts, how can I make sure that I do that in the best feminist way possible? When I have the opportunity to invite someone along for a meeting, who will that person be? Is there someone I can help promote?
Yeah.
There are always options, I would say.
Yes, so just constantly asking the questions, perhaps even writing down somewhere on your desk or wherever you do your organization, like a list of questions that you ask yourself.
Yeah. And I think a good way of doing that is just think of a person that you sort of like or look up to and just do, what would X do? I think that's one of the most helpful ways to actually...
Who's the X in your world? I need to know.
In my life,
yeah.
I would say that's probably Bell Hooks right now. It changes, but when I do this work, it's definitely Bell Hooks because she's so fearless and she's so smart.
Yeah, and also spiritual and open about that as well, which I think is quite interesting in the landscape of different, very academic, incredible progressors.
Exactly.
Cosette would like to know, do you think that using the word feminism implies that we are against equality, given history?
Oh, yes. No. Yes, I know what you mean, but no. I think this is... I was thinking a lot about this, putting this presentation together, but it's the first time I give this particular presentation. I've been thinking about this a lot. And I wanted to have the word feminism in there because I didn't see it in too many places in the agenda today. it is what we're talking about. So it is the elephant in the room. But I think it's definitely one of those words that need to be reclaimed because it doesn't mean that you're opposed to equality. It means that you're for equality. So if someone tries to make it something else, then they're wrong. And I mean, we can't adopt or adapt to people who are wrong. Maybe I'm being very sort of square and academic about this, but there is a definition of this phrase, and
Yes.
that's what I'm sticking to.
And what is the definition?
If you would ask, Bell Hooks, I think, has the best definition. Again, much Bell Hooks here. She says that it's to work against all types of gender-based oppression. So she's very firm on the idea that this applies to any type of gender. It would, of course, include men. It would, of course, anyone who's trans or anything else. Because everyone who's oppressed based on gender can benefit from feminism.
Leslie would like to know, do you feel we need to take more traditionally masculine, and they've put quotes there, habits?
No, because that research is wrong. Okay, and I'm going to go on a rant about this.
Please do.
You know the power poses? Oh, sorry, I'm so excited. you know the power poses study that was around a few years ago? It was a TED Talk where it was said that if women just stood in a more powerful posture, they would sort of be more successful at work. And you could do that in front of the mirror every morning and you would find yourself more successful at work. That study never checked out. It was one study and they never repeated those results anywhere. So all of these ideas that women need to be more male in order to come off as more professional.
Also, do men stand powerfully?
No, they don't. I mean, they're just guys. God. I mean, and again, like, you being more white is not going to help. Me being more male is not going to help. I mean, we have to go past all that.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I mean, the reason, like Mia was saying, that business gets better from diversity is because we're diverse in thinking, in acting. And again, this is not a personality. I mean, this is about skills and sort of gusto and working really hard. And that does have nothing to do with how you present yourself.
And I think perhaps sharing those skills as well, because when you think about it from a more global perspective, you know, with what we were discussing with Mia earlier, culturally, some cultures don't think about the world like this, you know, and I think that we need to stay focused on learning, you know, always learning.
Yes.
Always learning those skills and the words that we use. Very quickly, we're running out of time, but effective allyship. You said you have a problem with the word allyship. Why? And how can we, in terms of a concept, express our allyship for equality and a futuristic place that is a better place for us all?
Yeah, the problem for me is just that allyship sort of suggests that I don't have anything to gain from people around me being less oppressed. And I just don't think that's true, because I think that's key to democracy. I think it's key to prosperity, to the world being a better place, that everyone can sort of do what they need to do and be who they need to be. So I think that I would gain personally a tremendous amount from, for example, there being no racism or homophobia in society, even though I am white and straight. So just to clear that out, that like I am not sort of participating in those fights because I'm good. It's also sort of selfish, actually, because I think that's a much better society. But I like allyship in the sense that it sort of clarifies the roles that you can have in different sort of struggles and fights, and that it will be different depending on if you're personally affected by the oppression that you're trying to fight, or if you're just if you're not affected by that. Again, coming back to privilege, I think it's so important to always check yourself for your privilege, not because it's a competition that like who is most oppressed wins, quite the contrary, but because when you know your privileges, you can start using them. So I have the academic privilege. When is it useful for me to state the fact that I am a PhD? Sometimes it's very useful, especially when I sort of can refer another person into that room then, when I can sort of translate research into a more sort of digestible information that people can sort of have access to then. So check your privilege. Being a good ally, always about checking your own privileges, figuring out what can I do? Again, coming back to the CFMO, what can I do to help this fight?
Incredible. Thank you so much. And thank you for your brain.
Thank you.